The alarm on my wrist console screamed before I even opened my eyes. I was Commander Nora Bishop, and in that first breath of consciousness, I already knew something had gone wrong at the edge of our territory. My quarters aboard the station Meridian Watch were small, gray, and always cold, but that morning the cold felt different. It felt like a warning. I pulled on my uniform and rushed to the command deck, where Adam Cole was already waiting, his face pale under the blue light of the monitors. "Another council notice," he said, sliding a datapad toward me. "They are calling it a border adjustment." I read the words twice before they made sense. Kepler's Reach, our colony of 80,000 people, was being reassigned. Not destroyed, not attacked, just quietly handed over to another species because the council decided our claim to the land no longer mattered. This was not new. It was simply the latest chapter in a story that had been building for 3 years, ever since humanity was allowed to sit at the Galactic Council table. We were the newest species there, the smallest, the most fragile in their eyes. They called us promising. They called us young. What they meant was that we were beneath them, and they expected us to know it. I remembered my first council session like it was yesterday. I had traveled there as a junior officer attached to our diplomatic team, eager and hopeful, believing that finally humanity had a voice among the stars. Instead, I watched our ambassador seated at the very end of the chamber, farthest from the center, while species who had barely done anything worth noting sat closer simply because they had been members longer. Our scientists submitted breakthrough research on faster propulsion systems, and the council dismissed it as unrefined guesswork. Our fleet, small but disciplined, was assigned to escort duty for cargo ships instead of real patrol routes, as if we were errand runners rather than a genuine military power. Every time we tried to prove ourselves, someone reminded us, gently but firmly, that we were new here, that patience was expected of us, that respect had to be earned over generations, not years. We accepted it, not because we agreed, but because we understood the reality of our situation. Our homeworld was still recovering from resource strain after our first contact events. Our colonies were spread thin, undefended against threats from outside council space. We needed their protection, their trade routes, their technology exchanges. So we swallowed the insults, one after another, and told ourselves that someday things would change. Kepler's Reach was supposed to be proof that things were already changing. It was our first true colony beyond the solar system, built by hand over 6 years, home to families who had left Earth to build something new. Farmers, teachers, engineers, children born under an alien sky who had never seen Earth at all. It was ours, earned through sacrifice, not given as charity. And now the council wanted to hand it away. I stood on the command deck, staring at the notice, feeling something twist inside me that I hadn't felt before. Not simple frustration, something colder. "They are calling it resource equity," Adam said quietly. Apparently the Varuthi delegation requested access to the mineral deposits beneath the colony, and the council decided our presence there was, in their words, an inefficient use of space. "And our people?" I asked. "Relocation assistance," he said, reading from the notice. 90 days. 90 days to abandon 6 years of work. 90 days to tell 80,000 people that their homes, their farms, their schools, all of it belonged to someone else now, because a room full of aliens decided it was fair. I thought about the families I had met there during a supply run 2 years earlier. I remembered a woman named Grace Sutton, who ran the colony's small clinic, proud of the medical center she had built from nothing. I remembered her laughing as she showed me the garden behind the clinic, where she grew herbs found nowhere else in the galaxy, cultivated from seeds brought all the way from Earth. I remembered children playing in the dust near the landing pad, waving at our ship as it descended. Those children would now grow up somewhere else, displaced because the council said so. I sent a message to our ambassador that morning, a man named Henry Vance, asking what our options were. His reply came within the hour, and it told me everything I needed to know about how little power we truly had. "There are no options," he wrote. "If we refuse the adjustment, The Council has threatened trade sanctions that would cripple our supply lines within 6 months. We cannot survive that. We have no choice but to comply. No choice. Those words sat heavy in my chest for the rest of the day. I watched from a distance as the evacuation began. Transport ships arrived at Kepler's Reach, and families packed what little they could carry, leaving behind homes they had built with their own hands. I watched footage of Grace Sutton locking the door to her clinic for the last time, her face calm in front of the cameras but her hands trembling as she turned the key. Meanwhile, at the council chamber, representatives from a dozen species exchanged pleasantries over the deal. I saw footage of the Varuthi delegate smiling as he shook hands with our ambassador, thanking humanity for its cooperation and flexibility. I saw trade agreements signed moments later, granting the Varuthi expanded mining rights in exchange for what they called goodwill credits toward human technological development, credits that would take decades to matter. It was, on the surface, simply diplomacy. Beneath the surface, it was something else entirely. It was a lesson being taught to us, over and over, that our claims meant less than theirs, that our labor and sacrifice could be traded away whenever it suited someone more established. I did not shout. I did not protest publicly. None of us did. We had learned, painfully, that outward anger only confirmed what the council already believed about us, that we were reactive, unpredictable, dangerous in our impulsiveness. So we stayed quiet. We processed the relocation. We helped our people rebuild elsewhere, on a smaller world with fewer resources, farther from any trade route that mattered. But quiet does not mean forgotten. I began keeping a private log that night, something I had never done before. I wrote down every incident, every slight, every broken promise since our admission to the council, the escort duty assignments that ignored our combat readiness, the research papers dismissed without proper review, the trade tariffs applied unevenly against our exports while other species enjoyed exemptions. And now, Kepler's Reach. I did not know why I started that log. Perhaps some part of me understood that history required a record, that someday someone would need to explain how we arrived at whatever came next. I simply knew that pretending nothing had changed inside me would have been a lie. Grace Sutton sent me a message a week after the relocation was finished. It contained only a single photograph, the garden behind her old clinic, the herbs she had spent years cultivating, now left to wither under the Varuthi mining operation. Beneath the photo, she had written 5 words. "We will remember this too." I saved that message. I did not delete it, and I did not forget it. None of us did. The council believed patience was a virtue we lacked. In truth, patience was the only thing keeping us from acting on everything we had swallowed for 3 years. They mistook our silence for weakness, when it was actually restraint, chosen deliberately because we understood the cost of acting too soon. But restraint has limits. Even the calmest ocean holds pressure beneath its surface, pressure that builds slowly, invisibly, until something eventually gives way. I did not know it then, standing on the command deck of Meridian Watch with Grace Sutton's photograph glowing on my screen, that Kepler's Reach was only the beginning. I did not know that within a year, the council would push us somewhere far darker, somewhere that would finally answer the question every human in that chamber had been asking silently for years. How much would we accept before we stopped accepting anything at all? For now, all I could do was close the message, file my log entry, and return to my duties. The stars outside my window looked the same as they always had, distant and indifferent, but something inside me had shifted that day, quietly, permanently, like the first crack in ice that has not yet broken. I did not know yet how deep that crack would go. I only knew it was there. The months following Kepler's Reach passed in a strange kind of tension, the sort that hums beneath ordinary life without ever fully surfacing. On the outside, everything continued as before. Trade ships moved along their routes. Council sessions convened on schedule. Ambassadors exchanged formal greetings and signed formal documents. But inside our command centers, inside our private conversations, something had changed. We were watching the council more closely now, listening for the next slight, bracing for whatever came next. I was assigned, 6 months after the relocation, to oversee security consultations for a joint research initiative between Earth and a small independent research division stationed near the outer boundary of Council territory. The station was called Halden Point, a modest facility built to study energy signatures from a dying star system nearby. It was staffed by around 40 researchers, mostly human, with a handful of specialists from allied species who had chosen to work alongside us despite Council disapproval of such partnerships. I met the station's lead scientist, a woman named Claire Whitfield, during my first visit. She reminded me immediately of Grace Sutton, sharp, dedicated, protective of the work she had built from almost nothing. Halden Point specialized in stellar decay research, entirely peaceful, entirely academic, focused on understanding how dying stars released energy in their final centuries. It was the kind of quiet scientific work that rarely drew attention from anyone. That made what happened next even harder to understand. I received the alert during a routine patrol rotation, relayed through emergency channels marked with the highest priority classification. The Council had authorized what they called a peacekeeping enforcement action against Halden Point, citing intelligence that the station was conducting forbidden weapons research disguised as academic study. I remember staring at the message, certain there had been some mistake. Halden Point studied dying stars. It had no weapons division, no military applications, nothing that could remotely justify such an action. I contacted Claire Whitfield immediately, hoping to warn her, hoping there was still time. There wasn't. By the time my message reached the station, Council enforcement vessels had already arrived in orbit. I listened, helpless, from my post aboard Meridian Watch, as the situation unfolded through fragmented communications. The enforcement fleet gave the station 20 minutes to evacuate essential personnel before what they called a compliance strike would begin. 20 minutes, for a station with only 2 small transport shuttles capable of carrying a fraction of its staff. I contacted Fleet Admiral Marcus Dale immediately, requesting authorization to intervene, to send our nearest ships to assist with evacuation. His response came back sharp and immediate. We do not have clearance to enter that sector without Council approval. Any unauthorized movement will be treated as an act of aggression against the enforcement action. I remember gripping the edge of my console so tightly my knuckles ached. Somewhere out there, Claire Whitfield and her colleagues were trying to load as many people as possible onto shuttles never designed to move quickly, while a fleet built for war waited above them with a countdown running. I listened to the final transmission from Halden Point, recorded automatically by the station's emergency broadcast system. Claire's voice was steady, remarkably steady, as she confirmed that only 18 of the 41 staff members had reached the shuttles in time. The rest remained inside, still gathering research data, still hoping for a delay that never came. "This is Halden Point, requesting additional time," she said. "We are civilian researchers. We have no weapons here. Please confirm receipt." There was no confirmation. There was no delay. I will not describe what the enforcement records later showed happened to the station itself, only that it ceased to exist as anything more than debris scattered across a silent orbit, and that 23 researchers, people who had dedicated their lives to understanding dying stars rather than building weapons, did not survive. The Council's official statement arrived less than an hour later, calm and procedural, expressing regret for the loss of life, while affirming that the enforcement action had been necessary based on credible intelligence. When our ambassador demanded to see this intelligence, the Council cited confidentiality protocols and refused to release any supporting evidence. I sat alone in my quarters that night, replaying Claire Whitfield's final transmission over and over, memorizing the exact tone of her voice, the exact words she used, the exact silence that followed when no response came. I thought of Grace Sutton's photograph, the withered garden, the message she had sent. "We will remember this too." I thought of every insult, every dismissal, every quiet humiliation accepted in the name of patience and diplomacy. I thought of Kepler's reach, taken not through violence but through paperwork, through the slow erosion of everything we had built. And now this, real lives, extinguished not through any genuine threat, but through carelessness dressed up as necessity, because somewhere in the council chamber, someone decided that human researchers were expendable enough to make an example of. I was not alone in my fury. Across every human outpost, every ship, every command center, the same silence fell, the same stunned disbelief. This was different from anything before. This was not a colony reassigned or a trade agreement twisted against us. This was people, gone, because the Council did not think it necessary to verify its own intelligence before authorizing destruction. Admiral Dale called an emergency session of our Joint Command Staff 2 days later. I attended alongside representatives from every branch of our fleet, every diplomatic office, every research division still willing to speak openly. The mood in that room was unlike anything I had witnessed before. There was no shouting, no dramatic outbursts. Just a quiet, focused intensity that felt heavier than any argument could have. "We have given this council 3 years of patience," Admiral Dale said, his voice low and controlled. "We have absorbed every insult, every unequal treaty, every dismissive gesture, because we believed patience would eventually earn us respect. Instead, it earned us this." He gestured toward a screen displaying the final image captured from Halden Point before its destruction, the silhouette of the station against the dying star it had spent years studying. "I am not proposing reckless action," he continued. "I am proposing that we finally acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning. This council does not respect patience. It interprets patience as permission." I remember the silence that followed his words, not from disagreement, but from the weight of finally hearing something that everyone in that room had felt privately for years. Henry Vance, our chief ambassador, spoke next, his voice measured but firm in a way I had never heard from him before. "I have spent 3 years defending diplomatic patience as our best strategy," he said. "I no longer believe that strategy protects us. It only delays consequences we will eventually have to face regardless." We spent the following weeks gathering everything we could, every log, every transmission, every piece of evidence surrounding the Halden Point tragedy. Grace Sutton, now working within our Colonial Affairs office after Kepler's reach, contributed detailed records connecting the pattern of council decisions over the years, showing how each supposedly isolated incident fit into a broader pattern of dismissiveness toward human interests. I contributed my own private log, the one I had kept quietly since the day Kepler's reach was taken, documenting every slight I had personally witnessed. Reading it back during that period felt different than writing it had. What once felt like scattered grievances now formed a clear, undeniable pattern, one that had been building toward exactly this moment for years. We requested a formal council session to present our findings, demanding accountability for the Halden Point tragedy and a full, transparent review of the intelligence that supposedly justified it. The council granted the session, though not without visible reluctance, scheduling it for 3 weeks later. The earliest date they claimed was available. 3 weeks felt like an eternity, knowing that Claire Whitfield's final transmission still played in my mind every night, knowing that 23 people had died because a room full of powerful beings decided our lives mattered less than their convenience. I did not know exactly what would happen when that session finally arrived. I only knew that something inside humanity, something patient and careful for 3 long years, had finally reached its limit. We were done accepting quiet erosion as the price of survival. We were done trusting that patience alone would eventually earn us dignity. Grace Sutton sent me one final message before the session, echoing the words she had written after Kepler's reach, though this time they carried a different weight entirely. "They took our home quietly," she wrote. "They took our people loudly. I do not think we can afford to answer quietly anymore." I read her message twice, then closed my console and prepared for whatever came next. Whatever it was, I understood, finally and completely, that things could not continue as they had. The council had mistaken our restraint for weakness one time too many, and now we would show them, clearly and unmistakably, exactly what that restraint had been protecting them from all along. The council chamber felt different the day we arrived for the session, though nothing about its physical appearance had changed. The same vast circular room, the same ring of seats arranged by seniority, the same cold light filtering down from somewhere far above. What had changed was us. I walked beside Admiral Dale and Ambassador Vance, and for the first time since humanity joined this chamber, I did not feel like a guest asking permission to speak. I felt like someone finally prepared to demand an answer. We were seated in our usual position, far from the chamber's center, though this time the distance felt less like an insult and more like an irrelevant detail. Around us, delegates from a dozen species settled into their places, murmuring quietly among themselves. I noticed several glancing our way, perhaps sensing that something had shifted, though none of them could have guessed exactly what. The council speaker, a tall, composed figure from the Halvanari species, opened the session with the usual formalities before turning toward Ambassador Vance. The human delegation has requested this session regarding the Halden Point enforcement action, the speaker said. You may proceed. Ambassador Vance stood slowly, and I watched him take a breath before beginning, steady and deliberate in a way I had rarely seen from him before. 3 weeks ago, he began, an enforcement fleet acting under this council's authority destroyed a civilian research station, resulting in the deaths of 23 researchers. This action was justified using intelligence claiming forbidden weapons research at that station. We have requested access to that intelligence for 3 weeks. We have not received it. He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. We have since conducted our own independent review of Halden Point's research records, communications, and operational history. We have found no evidence, none whatsoever, supporting the claim that any weapons research occurred there. We are formally requesting that this council release its supporting intelligence immediately, or acknowledge that this enforcement action was conducted without adequate justification. A ripple of quiet conversation spread through the chamber. The speaker exchanged a glance with several senior delegates before responding. The intelligence in question remains classified under council security protocols, the speaker said. We can assure the human delegation that the decision was made with appropriate diligence. Appropriate diligence, Admiral Dale repeated, standing beside Vance now, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber. 23 people are dead because of appropriate diligence you refuse to show us. The speaker's composure flickered slightly, though he recovered quickly. The human delegation's frustration is understood. However, council protocols exist for reasons beyond individual grievance. I watched something shift in Admiral Dale's expression then, something I had never seen from him before, a kind of controlled, deliberate resolve settling over his features. With respect, he said, we did not come here today to request understanding for our frustration. We came to inform this council that humanity will no longer accept decisions made without transparency, evidence, or accountability. Kepler's reach was taken from us through paperwork we had no power to contest. Halden Point was taken from us through violence we had no warning to prevent. We have absorbed both, along with countless smaller injustices, because we believed patience would eventually be rewarded with respect. He paused, letting his words settle across the chamber before continuing. That belief has proven false. Effective immediately, humanity is withdrawing from all Council enforcement cooperation agreements. We will no longer permit Council enforcement vessels within human-controlled territory without explicit, verified justification reviewed by our own command authority. We will no longer accept trade terms negotiated without equal representation, and we will not forget the researchers who died at Halden Point, nor will we allow their deaths to be filed away as an unfortunate necessity. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, delegates from multiple species reacting with a mixture of confusion, irritation, and what I recognized unmistakably as concern. The speaker raised a hand, calling for order, though it took several moments before the chamber quieted enough for him to speak. This council does not respond well to unilateral declarations, he said, his voice carrying a warning edge now. Humanity remains a junior member of this body, and such actions could be interpreted as a direct challenge to council authority. It is not a challenge, Ambassador Vance replied evenly. It is a correction. This council has operated under the assumption that humanity's patience was limitless, that we would continue absorbing losses indefinitely, in exchange for tolerance, rather than genuine partnership. That assumption was incorrect, and we are here to correct it clearly, so there can be no confusion going forward. I watched the Varuthi delegate, the same species that had received Kepler's reach, lean forward with an expression of barely concealed contempt. "Perhaps," he said, "the human delegation forgets the scale of forces this council commands. Your fleet, however disciplined, remains small compared to what stands behind this chamber's authority." Admiral Dale turned toward him directly, his voice calm, but carrying an edge sharp enough to silence the murmuring around him. "We have not forgotten," he said, "but perhaps this council has forgotten something as well. You have spent 3 years dismissing our capabilities, assuming that because we are new, we must also be weak. You never bothered studying us closely, because you never considered us worth the effort. That assumption may prove to be the most significant miscalculation in this chamber's history." The speaker's expression tightened, though he said nothing immediately, perhaps sensing, as I did, that something fundamental had shifted in that room. We were no longer negotiating from a position of quiet desperation. We were stating facts, plainly and without apology, and daring the council to respond with anything other than the transparency and accountability we had been denied for years. "This session is adjourned," the speaker finally said, his voice tighter than before. "The council will convene privately to discuss the human delegation's declarations." As we left the chamber, I felt none of the anxious uncertainty that usually accompanied these sessions. Instead, I felt something steadier, something that had been building quietly for 3 years and had finally found its voice. Grace Sutton met us outside the chamber, having traveled to witness the session in person. She studied our faces carefully before speaking. "How did they respond?" she asked. "With confusion," Ambassador Vance said. "And perhaps, for the first time, with genuine concern." Grace nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Confusion is what happens when someone realizes the story they believed about you was never entirely true." I thought about her words later that night, replaying the session in my mind. For 3 years, the council had built their treatment of humanity around a single assumption, that we were young, inexperienced, and therefore easily managed. They had never considered that our patience was a choice, not a limitation, and that choices, unlike limitations, could always be revised. We received word 2 days later that the council had convened an emergency deliberation regarding our declarations, the first such emergency session called in response to a member species rather than an external threat. I understood, reading that report, that something had genuinely changed. The council was no longer treating us as a minor inconvenience to be managed quietly. They were beginning, however reluctantly, to treat us as something they needed to take seriously. I did not know yet what their response would be, whether they would attempt to negotiate, retaliate, or simply ignore our declarations entirely and hope the matter would resolve itself. I only knew that whatever came next, humanity would not retreat quietly back into patient silence. We had spent 3 years proving we could endure. Now it seemed we were finally ready to prove something else entirely. The council's response arrived not through diplomatic channels, but through action, and it came faster than any of us anticipated. 3 days after our declaration in the chamber, council enforcement vessels moved into position near 3 separate human colonies, citing what they called a routine compliance verification, following our withdrawal from enforcement cooperation agreements. I understood immediately, as did everyone in our command structure, that this was not routine anything. It was a warning, meant to remind us exactly how small our fleet appeared next to the forces the council commanded. I was aboard Meridian Watch when the alert came through, watching sensor readings populate across the main display as 3 enforcement fleets settled into formation near Ashgrove Colony, Halden Remembrance Station, renamed in honor of those lost, and the recently resettled community from Kepler's reach. The message accompanying their arrival was polite, formal, and entirely transparent in its intent. This deployment ensures continued council oversight during this period of diplomatic recalibration. The message read, "Cooperation is expected." Admiral Dale convened our command staff within the hour, and I watched him study the deployment maps with an expression I had come to recognize over the previous weeks: calm, calculating, and entirely unafraid. "They are testing our resolve," he said. "They expect us to either back down from our declarations or respond with the kind of disorganized aggression that would justify further enforcement action against us." "What do we do?" I asked. "We do neither," he replied. "We show them precisely what 3 years of quiet preparation actually built." What followed was not the reckless confrontation the Council likely anticipated. Instead, over the next several hours, human fleet vessels moved into defensive formations around each threatened colony, not aggressive, not provocative, simply present, disciplined, and unmistakably capable. Our ships, long dismissed by Council observers as unremarkable, revealed capabilities that had never been shared during previous joint exercises. Precision coordination systems developed independently, shielding technology adapted from research the Council had once dismissed as unrefined guesswork, and tactical formations designed specifically around defending fixed positions rather than pursuing offensive engagement. I listened over communications as the Enforcement Fleet Commander near Kepler's Reach's new settlement attempted to reassert Council authority, demanding that our vessels withdraw from what he called Council-designated oversight space. Our fleet commander's response was calm, measured, and unmistakably final. "This space belongs to a sovereign human colony," she said. "We are not withdrawing. We invite you to reconsider your position." The enforcement fleet did not immediately withdraw, and for several tense hours, both fleets held position, neither side advancing, neither side retreating. I understood, watching the standoff unfold through sensor feeds, that this moment represented something larger than any single colony or any single confrontation. It represented the answer to a question the Council had never bothered asking: what happens when a species you have consistently underestimated finally decides it has nothing left to prove through patience alone? The situation resolved not through confrontation, but through demonstration. Our fleet commander authorized a controlled display of our defensive capabilities, deploying countermeasure systems that neutralized the enforcement fleet's targeting arrays without a single shot fired, rendering their weapons systems temporarily inoperative while leaving their vessels entirely intact. It was a message delivered without violence, precise, controlled, and impossible to misunderstand. The enforcement fleet withdrew within the hour. Similar situations unfolded near Ashgrove Colony and Halden Remembrance Station, each resolved through disciplined defensive posturing rather than aggressive escalation. By the end of that day, all 3 Council enforcement fleets had withdrawn from human territory, their commanders reporting back to the Council with what I imagine were considerably more cautious assessments of human capability than they had held that morning. I received a message from Grace Sutton that evening, her tone reflecting the same quiet satisfaction I felt myself. "They came expecting fear," she wrote. "They found readiness instead." The Council's emergency session reconvened 2 days later, and this time, the atmosphere in the chamber felt entirely different from any previous meeting I had attended. Delegates who had once regarded our representatives with thinly veiled condescension now studied us with something closer to genuine attention, perhaps even wariness. Ambassador Vance addressed the chamber first this time, his voice carrying the same measured resolve from our previous session, though now reinforced by everything that had happened since. 3 days ago, this council attempted to test humanity's resolve through intimidation, he said. That test has concluded. We hope its results were instructive. The speaker's expression remained carefully neutral, though I noticed a subtle shift in how he addressed us now, more measured, more deliberate, as though choosing each word with considerably greater care than before. The Council acknowledges humanity's demonstrated capabilities, he said. However, we remain concerned about the precedent set by unilateral defensive actions against Council enforcement authority. The precedent, Admiral Dale replied, standing beside Vance, is simple. Humanity will defend its territory, its people, and its sovereignty against any force, regardless of its origin, that seeks to impose decisions without transparency or genuine partnership. We are not seeking conflict with this council. We are seeking exactly what we have always sought, respect earned through demonstrated capability rather than granted through condescending tolerance. I watched the Varuthi delegate, previously so dismissive during our earlier session, remain notably silent this time, his earlier contempt replaced by something more careful, more calculating. The speaker consulted quietly with several senior delegates before responding, and when he finally spoke, his words carried a weight I had not heard from the council before. The council proposes a formal renegotiation of humanity's membership terms, he said. Full voting representation, equal seating within this chamber, and mandatory transparency protocols for any enforcement action affecting human territory going forward. I felt something settle in my chest hearing those words. Not triumph exactly, but something quieter, more permanent, the recognition that 3 years of careful patience, followed by 1 week of unmistakable resolve, had finally accomplished what diplomacy alone never could. We accept these terms, Ambassador Vance said, on one additional condition: a full, transparent investigation into the intelligence failure that led to the destruction of Halden Point, with findings made available to this entire chamber, and appropriate accountability for whoever authorized that action without proper verification. The speaker hesitated only briefly before nodding. Agreed, he said. As we left the chamber that day, I understood that something fundamental had shifted permanently within the Council's relationship with humanity. We had not achieved this through aggression, nor through the reckless confrontation the Council likely expected from a species they considered impulsive and immature. We had achieved it through patience, carefully measured, followed by resolve, clearly demonstrated, precisely the combination the Council had never anticipated from us. I thought of Claire Whitfield that evening, wishing she could have seen this moment, wishing the 23 researchers lost at Halden Point could have known that their deaths would eventually lead to genuine accountability rather than quiet dismissal. I thought of Grace Sutton, standing in her withered garden, promising that we would remember. We had remembered, and more importantly, we had acted, not through the violence the Council perhaps feared, but through the disciplined resolve they had never bothered to expect from us. The investigation into Halden Point began within the week, and for the first time since humanity joined this chamber, we were treated not as guests seeking tolerance, but as genuine partners demanding, and finally receiving, the accountability every member species deserved. The investigation into Halden Point took 4 months to complete, longer than any of us expected, though I understood, watching the process unfold, that thoroughness mattered more than speed after everything that had happened. Grace Sutton, now serving as our primary liaison to the investigative committee, kept me updated throughout, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as the truth slowly emerged from beneath layers of bureaucratic obscurity. The intelligence that supposedly justified the enforcement action, it turned out, had originated from a single unverified source within the Varuthi delegation, someone with clear financial interest in seeing Halden Point's research disrupted, given the station's proximity to mineral deposits the Varuthi had long wanted access to. No independent verification had ever been conducted. The enforcement action had been authorized based on a single report, treated as sufficient simply because it came from an established species rather than a newer member whose objections might have demanded closer scrutiny. The Council's findings, when finally released, confirmed everything we had suspected. Halden Point had never conducted weapons research. The intelligence used to justify its destruction had been fabricated, likely to secure resource access disguised as legitimate security concern. 23 researchers had died not because of any genuine threat, but because a system built on hierarchy and assumption had never bothered verifying claims made against a species still considered junior enough to disregard. The individual responsible, a senior Varuthi intelligence officer, faced formal council sanctions, though I noted, reading the final report, that the punishment felt insufficient compared to the lives lost. Still, it represented something unprecedented, accountability extended toward a decision that affected humanity, rather than the quiet dismissal we had grown accustomed to over 3 years. I traveled to the newly rebuilt Halden Remembrance Station for the memorial ceremony marking the conclusion of the investigation, standing alongside Grace Sutton, Admiral Dale, and representatives from several other species who had begun, gradually, to treat humanity with genuine respect rather than tolerant condescension. Claire Whitfield's name was read aloud during the ceremony, along with the 22 other researchers who had died alongside her. I watched her family, gathered quietly near the memorial's edge, listening as her contributions to stellar decay research were finally acknowledged, not just by humanity, but by representatives from across council space who had traveled specifically to attend. The speaker himself attended, delivering brief remarks that felt, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely sincere rather than carefully diplomatic. "This council failed the researchers of Halden Point," he said. "We failed them through assumption, through insufficient verification, and through a hierarchy that valued established relationships over genuine truth. We cannot undo what was lost here. We can only ensure it is never repeated, for any species, regardless of how long they have sat within this chamber." I watched Grace Sutton's expression as he spoke, and I recognized in her the same quiet vindication I felt myself. Not celebration exactly, given everything that had been lost to reach this point, but recognition that our resolve had finally produced something meaningful. Kepler's reach remained a complicated matter throughout this period. The colony itself had already been resettled by the Varuthi, and reversing that arrangement entirely proved impractical given the years that had passed. However, as part of the broader renegotiation of humanity's council membership, we secured full compensation for the colony's original inhabitants, along with expanded territorial rights elsewhere that ultimately exceeded what Kepler's reach had originally offered. Grace Sutton oversaw the resettlement personally, ensuring that families who had lost everything received genuine support rather than the bureaucratic minimum previously offered during the original relocation. I visited the new colony 6 months after its establishment, walking through streets that reminded me, deliberately, of what Kepler's reach had once been. Grace showed me the new clinic she had built, larger than her original one, stocked with equipment secured through the improved trade terms our renegotiated membership had finally guaranteed. "It is not the same," she told me, standing in her new garden, where herbs from Earth grew once again, this time in soil that genuinely belonged to us. "But it is ours, and this time no one can simply decide to take it away without consequence." I thought often during those months about how dramatically our position within council space had shifted. Human representatives now held full voting rights within the chamber, seated according to the same seniority protocols applied to every other species rather than relegated to the chamber's edge. Our fleet, once dismissed as unremarkable, now received genuine respect from council military observers, several of whom requested formal exchange programs to study tactics and technology they had previously never bothered examining. Trade agreements were renegotiated across the board, ensuring equal terms rather than the quietly unfavorable arrangements we had accepted during our early years of council membership. Our scientists, whose research had once been dismissed without proper review, now found their work genuinely considered, occasionally even adopted by other species who had finally recognized value they had previously overlooked, entirely out of assumption rather than genuine evaluation. None of this erased what had been lost. Halden Point's 23 researchers remained gone, their families left to rebuild lives, permanently altered by a mistake that never should have happened. Kepler's Reach's original settlement remained lost as well, even if its people ultimately found something better elsewhere. I understood, reflecting on everything that had happened, that progress rarely arrives without cost, and that the respect we finally earned came only after enduring losses that should never have been necessary in the first place. I stood one evening, roughly a year after our declaration in the council chamber, aboard Meridian Watch, watching the same stars that had once felt distant and indifferent during those difficult early years of council membership. They looked the same as they always had, but everything surrounding them had changed permanently. Admiral Dale joined me on the observation deck, standing quietly beside me for several minutes before speaking. "Do you think this is truly finished?" he asked, "or simply the beginning of something else?" I considered his question carefully before answering. "I think," I said, "this proved something the Council needed to understand, that our patience was a choice, not a weakness, and that choices can always be revised when circumstances demand it. I do not know if every species within that chamber has genuinely internalized that lesson, but I believe enough of them have to prevent what happened to us from happening again, at least not without genuine consequence." Admiral Dale nodded slowly. 3 years of quiet endurance, he said, followed by 1 week that changed everything. "Not everything," I said, "but enough." I thought of Grace Sutton, tending her new garden in soil finally secured through genuine partnership rather than fragile tolerance. I thought of Claire Whitfield, whose death had ultimately forced accountability that might otherwise never have arrived. I thought of every quiet humiliation absorbed during those early years, every insult swallowed in the name of patience, every small sacrifice made because we believed, however naively, that eventually our restraint would be rewarded. It had been rewarded, eventually, though never in the way we originally hoped. We had not earned respect through patience alone. We had earned it through demonstrating, clearly and unmistakably, exactly what our patience had been protecting the rest of the galaxy from experiencing. The Council had gone too far, pushing us past every reasonable limit, mistaking our restraint for permission rather than choice. And when our patience finally broke, we had not answered with the reckless aggression they perhaps expected from a species they once considered impulsive and immature. We had answered with the same careful discipline that had defined us from the very beginning, precise, controlled, and entirely unwilling to be dismissed ever again. I stood there on the observation deck for a long while after Admiral Dale returned to his duties, watching the stars stretch endlessly in every direction, no longer feeling distant or indifferent, but rather like a vast, open space finally worth claiming fully, without apology, without quiet endurance, and without ever again mistaking patience for permission. Humanity had not wanted conflict. We had wanted, simply, to be heard, to be respected as genuine partners rather than tolerated as promising newcomers expected to earn dignity through decades of quiet suffering. We had achieved that, finally, though the cost of achieving it would remain with us permanently, a reminder carried forward into whatever came next among the stars. Whether the galaxy had truly learned its lesson, or whether this represented merely the opening chapter of something larger still to come, I could not say with certainty. I only knew that whatever happened next, humanity would face it not as quiet guests, seeking permission to exist, but as equals, finally recognized, finally respected, and finally, unmistakably, heard.